recording has started. So let me welcome you very much to EUCERS-Expert seminar on the very timely topic of Asia's energy megatrends on the one hand, and COP26 climate targets on the other hand. Where the challenges, what are the perspectives, what has been achieved. I think that is a very important subject, as especially we in Europe tend to look very much to our achievements, our goals, our ambitious targets. And basically the fight against climate change will be decided in Asia, as Asia will be the emerging economies, the developing countries in Asia, including, of course, China and India, will be up for more than 70% of the global energy demand by 2040. So there is the music, there are the CO2 emissions. That doesn't mean we in Europe should not do anything, but we should perhaps focus more attention on Asia, and therefore I'm extremely grateful that Michael Williamson from ASCAP in Bangkok and Frank Umbach have produced this wonderful study. Well, let me say just a few words to EUCERS at the beginning. We started in 2009 at King's College London, a European cluster for climate, energy, and resource security. It was Frank and myself who brought that center up. We got a lot of reputation. You know, these Pennsylvania rankings, and we were always, when it comes to energy think tanks, among the first, the top 20. So that was a very successful endeavor. And then 2 years ago, I was asked by the University of Bonn, my old alma mater, why don't you bring EUCERS to Bonn? We are establishing a new center, the Center of Advanced Security, Strategic and Integration Studies. We have funds for that from the state of North Rhine-Westphalia. Why don't you join us? And then I asked Frank, and then we decided to move that center over. Of course, it means now that we rebuild everything, that we bring new scholars to the center. So we're restarting, basically. And one of these activities is coming from Frank Umbach, who has been in London and is now our head of research. And Frank is known to most of you, but apart from his work in Bonn, he's also an adjunct senior fellow at the Rajasthan School of International Studies, RSIS, at Singapore, at the University of Singapore. He is a consultant to the German government, to the EU, to the House of Lords, to the Lithuanian government. You cannot name the list of institutions that have been consulted by Frank in the last decades. And we're happy to have him at EUCERS. And Frank, if you would give us an introduction, please not more than 15 minutes, so that we have time for discussion at the beginning. I already tell everyone I will be very strict with time rules. So Frank, the floor is yours.
Yes, I will share my also my presentation. Okay, so you should see it. Yeah, let me also firstly welcoming everybody, and secondly also to thank Michael Williams for asking me to do the study and for the very good collaboration in between. fine-tuning then the study, and finally also to publish it. So the purpose of the study was, I think from my side or from the side of UNESCAP, being tasked on me at the end or the autumn of 2020. It was a twofold one. Firstly, analyzing the new energy security risk challenges and dimensions with a focus, of course, of the Asia-Pacific region. And secondly, analyzing the impacts of the worldwide COVID pandemic on the energy policies, energy security in the Asia-Pacific region. To the overall importance of the Asia-Pacific region, I think Friedberg Flüger has already introduced it here, some of those facts why Asia matters more than ever. So some of those German discussions sometimes where you get the feelings that climate change will be decided in Europe, that's something I have not really understood as someone who has lived and worked also in Asia and working including on China's energy policies for 20 years. Which does not mean that Europe does not have an important role, but of course the ultimate energy developments, the energy demand forecast and growth is coming also from the Asia-Pacific region. And we will see it also later. Just one fact at the beginning, as we will see it later on the slide, China's share of the global greenhouse emission, or this global CO2 emission, has increased further in 2020 to meanwhile more than 30%. From 28% prior to the pandemic. And at the same time, the share of the EU has further gone down, approximately 7.7% today. Also, that excludes UK. By including UK, it's still 9%. And the overall forecast had already been prior to the pandemic that the share of the EU will further decline to approximately 5–6% just in 2030. The UN study, which I did for UNESCAP, had been built to some extent on another study I made 3 years ago for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Hong Kong, where I had already also addressed the new security risk very much linked with also renewable energies, with the decarbonization processes, as well as the digitalization technologies. And Irina myself, or Irina has also published a very insightful study at the same time in 2018 on the geopolitics of renewables, which came interestingly also to similar results alongside a few other studies which started also around this time on addressing the geopolitical dimensions, new security risks linked with the renewables. As you can see here, what I put together for a publication also at 3 years ago in 2018 was all the number of the major changes of the global energy markets, also new technologies coming in, which are changing the global energy markets tremendously. It's not just that one technology comes in and will change a smaller sector of the global energy markets. I think we need to be aware that all these disruptive technologies offer, of course, huge possibilities, particularly also in regard to climate change. But at the same time, this is the second side of the coin, also create numerous new security risks for energy supply security for all countries around the world. Just give a short overview on some of those changes. Traditional energy supply security, as we have understand it for decades, had very much to do, of course, with fossil fuels. It started in the 1970s with the oil crisis. In Europe, with beginning of 2006, we were facing a gas supply crisis as a result of the Russian-Ukrainian conflicts, which had repeated in 2009, 10, and 2014. Basically in the past, we understood these are physical attacks on oil and gas infrastructures. And these physical attacks leading to disruption of oil and gas supplies, the political instabilities of producer and exporter countries is of course something which have not disappeared today. Yeah, and in 2019, we had these Iranian drone attacks on Saudi oil infrastructures, for example. We see how critical sea lanes of communication and choke points are still, such as the Strait of Hormuz or the Indian Ocean or the Malacca Strait. Again, these threats have not disappeared, but at the same time, by introducing all these new disruptive technologies alongside of the much wanted energy transition and decarbonization, also cybersecurity risk and threats to critical energy infrastructures, in particular, have dramatically increased over the year, as we have just seen in the spring of this year, when a cyber attack on one of the major oil pipelines in the US had happening, leading to a disruption of oil supplies, both to the civilian population as well as actually to the US armed forces, which is still a subject of investigation on the US side. The global energy transition has a lot to do with the so-called 3Ds: decarbonization, decentralization, and digitalization. And the geopolitical risk and supply disruptions, as I said, have been considered exclusively linked with fossil fuels. Renewables have been seen as immaterial and available always everywhere, and one can ever embargo the sun. So there is a myth to which also, I have to say critically, the German Environment Ministry 10 years ago contributed much by arguing that energy supply security threats and risks are only related to fossil fuels. That seems to be confirmed at a first glance, but at the second glance, I think when we look a little bit more closer, as IRENA did itself, there are a range of new very severe threats we already experiencing, but may even experience much more than in the past, including the rising dependence of critical raw materials for renewable energies, whether that's wind power, whether that's solar power, etc. As electricity becomes ever more important as a main carrier of energy in the future, by electrifying the transport sector, by electrifying all kinds of industries, the so-called Industry 4.0 challenges, these very fundamentals of electricity markets are very much questioned and challenged. We need a very different understanding in the future about also the potential threats and risk linked with that. These disruptive technology changes taking place, particularly in the electricity sector, is not just technology revolutions. Its impacts for companies and governments are far more outreaching. Business models, organizational structures, and company cultures need completely to change. Yeah, that makes a huge difference. The IEA has warned, and I found it still quite adequate, by arguing in 2017, and I quote a study: "The interest in this topic is strong, but the world's current understanding of the scale and scope of its potential remains limited, particularly when it comes to analytically rigorous assessments of those new energy security risks linked with decarbonization and the difficult, complex energy transition." As you can see here, on this slide, this is just highlighting the overall dependence of all critical infrastructures on, firstly, on a stable electricity supply. No critical energy infrastructure will work without a stable electricity supply. And secondly, all these critical infrastructures are dependent on a stable access to the internet. And these are the two main dependencies which also raise the cybersecurity threats and risk and potential cascading impacts they may have by attacking one infrastructures, and then the virus is moving to the next one and have this disastrous impacts, as a Bundestag study of 2011 was highlighting, by concluding that after approximately 4 or 5 days, all the public life, public order, etc., we experiencing normally are collapsing with any kind of state function and no longer being available. When in the study, we also differentiated and highlighted and discussed a little bit, there's also differences between energy security and resiliency. I came across resiliency actually more than 10 years ago when I began to work on cybersecurity risk and challenges, where I came across a resilience concept. Today, resiliency is used in all kinds of fields, etc., also in terms of energy supplies issues. Remember last year we were speaking about energy, about the supply chain dependencies and risk linked with the health sector and medical equipment, where we discovered that we may be over-dependent on Asia and China, and to some extent on India too. And here again, resiliency offers concept as a precondition or a part of energy security to make the energy system more robust against energy supply disruptions, and restore the systems as soon as possible. So that's the basic idea behind resilience, which is, as I said, used across the board of all kinds of fields today. So in this respect, our understanding of resiliency has very much changed. Another big challenge in the years ahead is, of course, alongside the expansion of renewables, the need to preserve baseload stability. And in this respect, the battery storage, battery technologies come in. Fortunately, we have experienced here also tremendous decline of prices, which offers and have made also batteries much more competitive as at least a short-term storage opportunity. And so batteries are even built in wind power stations today or in solar power stations today. And that helps us in preserving and stabilizing also the baseload stability when wind and sun is not available for 24 hours. And here you can see on the left side, on the left slide, that the biggest demand growth is actually expected in India. India, in the forthcoming decade, may become the most populated state in the world, surpassing even China with 1.4 billion people. And so the energy demand growth in India is one of the highest in the world. And in this respect, India will play, as we have partly seen it on the COP26 summit already, an ever-growing role in the global energy debates, etc. As I said, I already hinted that energy and other technology and renewable energies and other technologies are very much dependent on a stable supply of critical raw materials. And here again, we will also face huge challenges ahead. You can see here on this slide that many of those critical materials, particularly not just in the production field, but also in the processing refinement field are very much controlled by China. So there's an over-dependence on the global supply of critical raw material on China to an extent which is far beyond actually the concentration of the remaining oil and gas reserves, which we very much discussed for decades, being very much centered in the Gulf, in the Greater Gulf region, before the shale oil and gas resources in the US have been discovered. So the challenges in this respect, in terms of diversification and a global, stable global supply, are much more much more challenging than we have ever witnessed in the traditional fossil fuel world. And that will lead to a situation, as you can see here again on the left side, where after 2030, the overall world dependence on fossil fuels will decline, which creates a lot of problems by itself, particularly for the oil and gas producing countries. When you think upon the OPEC countries or Russia, where 50, 60, 80% of the state budget are dependent still on the exports of oil and gas, and partly also coal resources. But at the same time, the rise of dependence, on imports, for example, from raw materials will dramatically increase at a time when the fossil fuel dependence will decline. And that will raise, as I said, maybe even more challenges in the years and decades ahead for the global as well as for the European supply. When we're looking, and it leads a little bit to the COP26 summit, to the forecasts and scenarios the IEA is using, then of course the situation before the summit was that we are very, very far actually from the 2015 net zero target. The sustainable development scenario here was described by the IEA before the pandemic as rather not, at least not taking place. I would not say it's unrealistic, but I would say we are very, very far from that kind of scenarios. The trends were really pointing to the scenario of the so-called stated policy scenario. You can see here what that means for the fossil fuel demand, etc., and dependence by the year 2040. On the right side, and Nicholas will certainly speak more in detail about it, you see the tremendous decrease of the cost of renewables. And that's, of course, very, very positive. But we should not forget, and that's also a lesson of the German Energiewende, behind the decrease of the cost of renewable, we have this so-called, what I call the hidden systemic costs. Some other experts call it a little bit differently. What I mean is, when you reach a certain kind of share, in the German case it was around 20% of the electricity sector, then of course you come to a point where you need to modernize the entire energy sector. So the cost of decreasing costs of renewables are only part of the story of the difficult energy transition. You have to modernize the grids, otherwise you can't use the renewables to the extent as it would be necessary by replacing fossil fuels. You need to have subsidies still, either for nuclear power, gas power stations, in preserving some kind of baseload stability. At least for the time being, you cannot totally rely on batteries in this respect. So this is particularly important for developing countries. You need to face a realistic assessment of the cost of the energy transition. The other bigger results from the study was very much related to the pandemic situation and the economic financial impacts. And what comes out from that analysis is, of course, that the economic financial impacts of the pandemic are, particularly in the discussion in Europe, I have the feeling, completely overlooked or completely underestimated. I was recently reading that 32 million people in India have fallen from the middle class back to the poor people, even having very often no access to electricity any longer. So the sustainability goals and the progress the world made, the developing countries made in Asia and Africa and elsewhere, have partly been destroyed or halted or even going back actually as a result of the economic financial situation. And the future financial possibilities of financing a more ambitious, a faster energy transition are very, very much challenged actually today, as public funds of these countries have been completely destroyed and have been severely impacted and constrained for the time being. And we should not overlook that the global pandemic, as in Europe too, has not ended. It's extremely difficult to forecast when a complete global economic recovery will take place. Particularly at a time when accounting for just 60% of the world population, they have secured 60% of the global vaccine supplies. And that makes these countries even more vulnerable for the time being and making any economic recovery even more difficult. And that makes also the green energy transition much, much more difficult in the years ahead. So the financial implications are very, very much severe. The other problem is when you're not looking from a climate point of view, but from an energy point of view, you come to a different kind of conclusion how fast an energy transition should be. Yeah, the faster the world energy transition is taking place, then the bigger the instabilities for the oil and gas importing countries will be. An unprecedented pace of the energy transition is accompanied by unpredictability, tsunamis of innovation and non-anticipated disruptive implications. So from an energy security point of view, you come rather to a conclusion that you should manage the energy transition not too fast, in contrast to the needs of climate change. And I think this is very important when you have to balance short and mid and long-term impacts and take long-term views on those issues. Just one point at the end, of course, the future energy transition depends very much on the overall global bilateral relationship between the US and China and others. And what concerned me, which came out already, which you could witness or could view, was at the end of 2020, when China, meanwhile actually also Russia, seek to instrumentalize the US and EU climate policy interest geopolitically, meaning that China makes any more ambitious climate policies and collaboration with the EU and the US dependent actually on Western concessions on sensitive issues such as the Taiwan Strait, such as human rights, such as Xinjiang and others. Though that is a huge challenge. And at the end, let me just bridge to the next presentation. I think there is as I said, a pre-existing also gap between experts on global change on one hand and global energy experts on the other hand. The latter, including myself, have often been much, much more skeptical whether a much faster energy transition and decarbonization can take place. And to some extent, I'm even a little bit positively surprised actually that some important progress has been made. Also, much of these promises the countries made still remain to be implemented, and here again are big question marks. We have seen, and that came already out of my study, we have seen that now at COP26, there is an increasing gap between the developing world and developing and developed countries, as the developed countries did not live up to now to promise to mobilizing $100 billion annually by 2020, as they agreed in the Paris Agreement. And here again, this lack of empathy, I think, on the side of Europe, which mobilized 750 billion funds for the Green Deal, something which, with the exception of the United States, no other region has done that in a similar way as Europe had done it and could done it financially. Long-term targets, but no concrete pathways. This is a challenge, I think, we will see after COP26 to implement those promises and targets, when many of the foreseen technologies, such as carbon capture and storage or hydrogen, are proven technologies to some extent, but they are not available commercially. They are not available already in an industrial scale to implement those targets. And one of the differences which have not been solved on COP26 is actually the European side has legally binding targets and etc. This is not something other countries have. To some extent, maybe the US, but the rest of the world has politically declared targets, which are not in the same way as binding, etc. And we have seen that even in 2020, more than 50% of new investments have still went actually to fossil fuels rather than to low carbon energy, energies. Here sees a slide to which extent the share of greenhouse emission have changed. When you see on the left side between 1990 and 2015, the share of China in 1990 was just 11%, 2015 26%. On the right side you see China today more than 30%. The decline of Europe has always declined. The share of the US of emission has also dramatically declined over the years, etc. You see then, this is the last slide, on the left side, the net zero emission pathway as recommended by the IEA. You see how fossil fuel use need to be decreased by the year 2050. In its publication in April of the net zero emission pathway, the IEA even recommended from today no longer make any kind of investment in fossil fuels. And predictably, particularly also in Asia, that has very much criticized and as completely unrealistic. And you see now on the right side, the last slide is on the impact of COP26 as of today. When you see after the first week, you can be to some extent a little bit more optimistic, but you can on the other hand question mark whether the targets will really be implemented. And the implementation challenges have rather increased by the year, with some positive signals coming out. I'll stop here, and that leads also to the other presentation. Many, many thanks for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Frank. Can you again take your slides off?
Yeah. Yeah.
So thank you. It was somewhat longer than 15 minutes, which you had advertised before, but as it was really extremely interesting, I thought I should not interrupt you. And I welcome Michael Williamson. Michael, we're happy that you join us from Bangkok. You're the section chief in the energy division of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, ASCAP. and you're working there on regional cooperation for sustainable energy across ASCAP's 53 member countries, intergovernment dialogue, technical assistance, research, and before you have been acting director of ESCAP's sub-regional office for South and Southwest Asia, overseeing 10 countries of South and Southwest Asia. So someone who is extremely experienced in all the topics that Frank has mentioned, and brings a perspective to us which is, as I said at the very beginning, sometimes not seen strongly enough in Europe. So please, Michael, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Pfluger. It's a real pleasure to join you, and I've really found this dialogue very interesting, and I think it's an essential dialogue to have because, you know, the world is changing so quickly in terms of energy and technology. We're seeing, in fact, the fusion of technologies from different fields into the energy sphere, which is really making the future more difficult to project. And I guess the rate of change is accelerating. And those of us who've been in the renewable sector for many years, or the clean energy sector, have been frustrated by how slow the rest of the world has been to recognize kind of the potential of decarbonization and new energy technologies. And I think, you know, what we're seeing now is this kind of real acceleration and real hope for the future. But as we go into this energy transition, you know, we shouldn't be blind to the risks. It's not a question of saying the risks are too great, let's not have an energy transition. It's about saying decarbonization is the only option. As a planet, we don't have alternative options. We need to decarbonize as quickly as possible. But in the process of decarbonization and adopting these new technologies and new systems and new infrastructure, what are the risks that we need to foreshadow and actively take measures to guard against so that we don't end up with these unexpected outcomes or unanticipated outcomes as we go through the energy transition? And I think that's what's really so interesting and why we were keen to work with Frank, because you know, Frank's work with Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, this report on energy security in the modern age, is a real eye-opener. It's a really important set of issues that he surfaced about how the energy world is changing. And we see the relevance to this of the Asia Pacific region. And, you know, just to, I guess, highlight some of the challenges that we experience. I mean, Asia Pacific is not a homogeneous region. We have a huge amount of diversity. So we have, you know, very small island countries, developing countries. We have landlocked countries through to the massive industrialized economies. So we have countries that are both leading the charge on energy technology and development, and other countries which are really just on the bottom of the spectrum in terms of adopting new technologies. So we can't really speak of it in kind of homogeneous terms, but in fact, Asia Pacific, as you pointed out, you know, it's the region that is really driving future energy growth, future carbon dioxide emissions. So really the area that the region of the world that needs a lot of support and a lot of focus from all of us. So it's hard to really come after Frank and follow his presentation because it was so rich in detail. But what I might do, in fact, is just try to add a little bit of perspective from the point of view of Asia Pacific, and to talk a little bit about some of our other reports that we've done, and really maybe cherry pick what we see are the most interesting or the most kind of prescient aspects of the report that Frank worked on. And first of all, a full credit to Frank, because while we partnered to develop this report, my role really was a secondary role in terms of working through different drafts, reviewing drafts, or arranging for the peer review, and often debating with Frank on different points, because we didn't agree on 100% of the issues. We agreed on most of them. And I think the areas where we diverged are the really interesting areas where a lot more work needs to be done to broaden this understanding. So let me just, for those of you not familiar with ESCAP, the UN has 5 regional commissions across the world, and ours is obviously the biggest as it represents Asia Pacific. With 62 member states. If we include the member states outside the region, it's 62, with 53 within the region, and 2/3 of the world's population. So the Commission focuses on many areas that are relevant to sustainable development, but of course I'm in the energy division, and we have colleagues covering a range of other issues, and we get the opportunities to collaborate on many topics, including recovering from COVID-19 is an interesting one because we have an ESCAP-wide program about building forward better to provide analysis and models for countries to recover from COVID-19, which is truly a cross-institutional effort. So in terms of our division and more broadly ESCAP, we have these three modalities. I mean, you meet people and you say, okay, you work for the UN, what do you do? How do you do your work? This is kind of the simplest way I find to explain. We have intergovernmental dialogue where we form a platform where countries can connect with each other and connect with us. And in terms of energy, we're using that platform to promote energy connectivity and cross-border electricity trade, as well as follow up on SDG 7 targets. So pointing out where the region is faring poorly or faring well, and really focusing attention and resources on what we need to do to speed up progress. The second is about knowledge building and research. And you can appreciate that, from our perspective, working with so many different countries, we see lots of cross-cutting issues and avenues where we can actually build a knowledge base and create research products that really help member countries grapple with challenges that they're facing. I mean, just before we started this webinar, Frank and I were talking about hydrogen. Obviously, countries have different takes and different perspectives on hydrogen, but it's really important that we, for example, also develop knowledge products on hydrogen to develop countries in the early stage of trying to understand this technology and how it might work in their energy systems. And the third one is technical assistance and capacity building. We do a lot of work with officials from member states to build their capacity in different technical areas, to take good practices and share them, and to put in place e-learning systems on a range of different energy topics. So really that's a snapshot of how we work. So just continuing, obviously I pointed out before that we have a lot of work to do to attain SDG 7 targets by 2030. I won't dwell on this too long, but I mean, in our different publications, we track how the region is going. We also have what we call the Asia Pacific Energy Portal, which is an online energy database where you can get up-to-date information. But I suppose, the biggest gaps we see are clean cooking, where we're struggling to reach 100% clean cooking by 2030. And in terms of renewable energy, if we look at modern renewable energy, in other words, if we exclude the energy used for traditional biomass like cooking and so forth in rural regions, the growth of renewable energy, while it's growing strongly, as overall energy demand is growing, it's struggling to gain a major share of the consumption. It's doing well in the electricity sector, but broadly speaking, there's a long way to go. So these are some of the issues that we're grappling with in terms of SDG 7. I just wanted to touch a little bit on two linked knowledge products. The first is our flagship report, which we put out earlier this year, which was really to support the meeting we had of the ESCAP Committee on Energy, which is really the means by which we engage with member states on energy issues. So every 2 years, this committee convenes. And this flagship publication, the Regional Trends Report, was put out with two purposes in mind, I suppose. The first purpose is to really give an up-to-date assessment of where we are on SDG 7, but then much more interestingly maybe is to look at some of the new and current issues on the energy landscape, such as the impact of COVID-19 on the energy transition, and to look a bit more deeply about the issues that Frank was speaking about, energy security and resilience, and really to raise a lot more awareness about some of the issues. How does the clean energy transition play out with security and resilience? What are some of the new concepts? And I think Frank's report was really instrumental in framing this report. It was really an important kind of foundation document to develop this. So I won't go into all of it, but I've included the QR code for anybody who wants to read it offline. And the second one, of course, is the one that Frank has just spoken about, and nobody is better to describe it than Frank. But I mean, what I will try to do is really pick out what's interesting for us in terms of Asia Pacific and maybe give our perspective as a regional commission on this. So as I said before, the world of energy is changing quickly. And the old paradigm for energy security and perhaps even how we assessed the global energy security or the regional energy security needs to change. I mean, the traditional model of energy security is about hydrocarbons, perhaps looking at risk to supply of gas, of oil, strategic reserves of oil, the electricity system. There's a couple of aspects which Frank has touched upon, which I think are relevant. I mean, cybersecurity is a really important one because if we're looking at electricity as the principal means by which we supply energy to the industry and society, electricity is vulnerable because a lot of it is vulnerable to cyber attack, of course. If you look at smart meters, many countries in the region are adopting smart meters. These are great from the point of view of managing networks and billing and sending better price signals to consumers, but they represent a point of failure because they're vulnerable to cyber attack. Frank touched on critical raw materials. I think this is really interesting because the map of where CRMs are originating from and going is really complex. They're coming from across the globe. So in one sense, this is a global issue as much as it is a regional one. But I think the whole CRM topic deserves a lot more study and focus. And there are strategies for reducing vulnerabilities to do with CRMs. There are issues such as substitution. So in the design of new, say, batteries or electric motors or generators, can certain rare earths, which are really under pressure in terms of supply, be replaced by other chemistries, for example, using cobalt in place of lithium? Obviously, there's a need for recycling, and that needs to be incorporated in the product design. So as products are designed, they should be designed in such a way that you can extract those materials from them at the end of life. And of course, there's the issue of boosting supply through new exploration and new mines and processing capacity. But if we look at the future, maybe 40 years down the track in Asia Pacific and add up all of the wind turbines and electric vehicles, there will be a huge stock of critical raw materials embodied in these devices and infrastructure and generators. And what we really need to make sure is that as those devices and infrastructure reach the end of life, we can in fact access that material again to build the next generation of clean energy devices. One point I just wanted to touch on is electricity as the principal energy carrier. I mean, what we observe is that in terms of the transition to renewable energy, it's really, we should be saying the transition to renewable electricity, because in fact, it's electricity where we've been able to successfully drive down the cost and have technologies such as solar and wind play a much greater part. At the same time, on the consumption side, we've said across the Asia Pacific, it is much more beneficial to supplement electricity in certain applications, such as heat pumps, such as electrification of transport. We can expect this trend to continue. So even before these trends have really gained momentum, over the last 10 years, we've seen electricity as a proportion of final energy consumption grow from about 12% to 19%. So even though the entire energy envelope is getting bigger, the proportion of electricity in energy consumption is growing. And this is before we've got mainstream electrification of transport. I mean, electric vehicles are in the single digits now in most countries. We're nowhere near gaining majority market share. When we get there, electricity will be a much, much bigger part of the overall need. So this really puts a focus on electricity and particularly the security of the electricity system as a strategic imperative for the future. And of course, there are other interesting points that were raised in the report about as we go through decarbonization, there are winners and losers, and the lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think in terms of COVID, we see two dimensions to this. I think one dimension is that COVID-19 in one sense was maybe a near miss. It could have been a lot worse in terms of the characteristic of this virus, in terms of its mortality and its ability to spread. You could have viruses which are worse on both of those counts, which could, I guess, really undermine the ability of society to perform essential functions like keep power stations running. So we need to think about which power systems are more resilient than others. How do we make existing infrastructure more resilient in terms of COVID? I think that's one side of it, is the security of supply. The other side is what do we do now that hopefully COVID is to a large extent behind us and we move into the economic recovery phase? what we've advocated in ESCAP through our Building Forward Better is that when it comes to economic stimulus, investing in clean energy technologies not only helps us achieve these global goals of decarbonization and sustainable energy, but also it creates more employment and it generates more economic activity, particularly in things that are not necessarily that exciting, like building energy retrofits. When you retrofit old buildings to make them more efficient, you generate a lot more jobs than you do in other comparable interventions in the energy sector. So there's a huge opportunity there to divert this stimulus in a way that it's very, very productive. And so I just wanted to finish with this slide, which is really just to highlight, the COVID experience. And this is really speaking to the issue of interconnected systems. I mean, one way to look at energy, it's a meta infrastructure. It's infrastructure that enables other types of infrastructure to happen. If you take energy out of the picture, you don't have ICT, so you don't have broadband and communications and cloud computing. You don't have healthcare, so you can never look after your population and respond to a pandemic. And you can't move your goods around the world. You don't have transports and logistics. And if we think about the COVID response last year, when the world was going through this incredible mobilization of effort to contain and manage this disease, energy, of course, was there in all of the aspects of the response. So I think the COVID experience just reminds us how critical energy is, and that we need to adopt a very open mind about the nature of future threats to the energy system and how we countermand them. So I think I've used up my 10 minutes. I'd better finish there, but thank you very much for your attention, and I'd pass the floor back to Professor Pfluger.
Michael, I thought that was very enlightening, and especially that you also look to the interconnection with energy security with other fields like health, like transport, like raw materials, so cyber. Thank you so much for that insight. And we know that with you in Asia, we have somebody to whom we can rely on also in the future when we want to do some research, want to get some knowledge. So thanks for joining. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce Nicolas Wagner. Nicolas is Program Officer at the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, and he is located at IRENA's Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn. He's one of those who focuses on global, regional, and country analysis and energy transition roadmaps, with a special focus to renewable energies, of course. And Nicolas has worked beforehand on renewable energy consulting in California. He had research positions at the German Institute for Economic Research and as German Chancellor Fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation at the Fraunhofer Institute for Solar Energy Systems. He also had important impact on the debates. Nicolas, we're looking forward to IRENA's view. Please.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Pfluger. And I wish you and your new institute all the luck in your foundation and becoming another leading institute here in Bonn, Germany. And we look forward to hopefully collaborating with you. And thank you, Frank, for the invitation. And hopefully we can continue this discussion about collaboration. It was also nice to see the results from the report that you and Mr. Williamson presented. I have to say, most of what you said, I think, echoes a lot of what we've been saying, and I have to say there's a lot of agreement and perspective that comes out of that report and the interesting work that you guys are doing there. So if you would like, Frank or whomever, or shall I share the presentation? Oh, it's coming up right now. Okay, great. So I'll go through this very quickly. I'll try to stick to under 10 minutes. We can discuss more topics afterwards if you would like. But I will be presenting a perspective based on our most recent World Energy Transition Outlook, which came out in this summer. But this builds really on effort that we've been doing for almost 8 years on global energy scenarios and perspectives From Irina's perspective, which I think aligns quite closely with that now of what many other organizations are saying in terms of the dominance in future energy scenarios and perspectives of renewables and also other low carbon technologies. It's important to note we don't just do global, so we actually work on regional and country level to make roadmaps and engage countries directly for more actionable work. And much of the work that I do has actually been focused on Asia. And currently I'm working on 3 projects in Asia, in Indonesia, Malaysia, and all of ASEAN. But I've also been engaged in China and other countries in the region. So the importance of the region is evident. It's really the key to making the transition happen, and is where all energy demand growth in the future will come from. And it's where the majority of the solutions that are needed need to be deployed wide scale. So of course, COP has resulted in some new announcements in terms of what countries plan. We make an assessment based on government plans as of the time of our analysis, which was more or less late last year into early this year. But based on that analysis, we have energy-related CO2 emissions flatlining based on commitments. So that's the yellow line that you see there. Of course, there's a more of a business usual trajectory. So if countries do not fulfill their commitments, you'll see it increase. But we see a flatlining of emissions. This is more or less consistent with temperature rise in the mid-2s. 2.6% or so. Of course, what's come out of COP and more recently is a little bit more ambition, at least words. And based on the analysis that was presented earlier, and Carbon Action Tracker did a good summary this week, depending on how you can interpret that, you could have the latest commitments range from maybe the high 1s up into the high 2s. So there's always a tremendous amount of uncertainty based on the interpretation of NDCs. Because the scope is not always is not uniform, and the commitments span things from efficiency to renewable shares to CO2. But what we see is definitely a movement towards net zero commitments amongst major economies. It was interesting to see that Vietnam has come out and said that they're aiming for net zero emissions. We know Indonesia, for instance, will target 2060 with even as early as 2050 with international help. We've seen commitments from China for 2060, for Japan, South Korea, of course, US, Europe. So it seems like we're moving in that direction. What is lacking is much detail in terms of how that can be accomplished. And so the real focus, I think, over the coming years will be how do you actually operationalize a pathway towards net zero? And this is something we've been doing now since our founding. Specifically the team I work in, the Renewable Energy Roadmaps team, we've been doing this for years. So I think we can provide interesting insights. And you can see here, we published a 1.5 degree scenario getting to zero. And you can see the scope of the what's needed. It's not just electricity, there's the industry side, there's transport, there's non-energy use. And this is just CO2, of course, then there's CO2 equivalents and other CO2 from land use. And there's also been developments in that with the methane pledge that came out of COP, and also all the countries that signed on, including Brazil, to eliminate deforestation by 2030, which in theory, combined with other efforts in land use, could result in a reduction from 4 to 5 gigatons of annual emissions in the land use and land use change area to potentially zero. And that would be a very good development if that could happen and should happen. Next slide, please. We like to point out that there is actually not a single solution. Even though we in theory represent renewables and they're a huge part of the solution, the efficiency first principle should be paramount, and there's definitely a very key and integral role for efficiency. And it should be, this is one area actually where even Europe is lagging and has, most countries are lagging in this area, and it should be the focus. The electrification topic was touched on earlier. Electrification with renewables, of course, or with zero carbon electricity is what needs to happen. And the reason we pull that out and show that separately is because it's mainly for demonstration purposes, but it's also considered both an energy efficiency measure all cases, electrification with renewables, for instance, is a significant efficiency improvement, but it's also a renewable solution. So in a way, it could be distributed into either. What's obviously the topic du jour is hydrogen and its derivatives, let's say. And for that, we envision a role. But despite all the talk and focus, it's essentially 10% of the solution, an important 10% and a huge challenge, but it's a minority, a small minority of the solution. We're not going to be into a situation within the next 30 years where hydrogen is half of all energy. And then there's still an important role for CCS, particularly in industry segments, and I can talk about that. Next slide, please.
Well,
thank you. So in terms of energy demand, this was alluded to, that the role of electricity is increasing. We see that becoming the majority energy carrier by mid-century, whereas roughly 50, half of all energy is directly electrified. Go back, thank you. But that hides the fact that there's also a role for electricity in green hydrogen production, representing another, let's say, 8% of energy consumption in final energy terms, and then the remainder can be blue hydrogen. So in essence, roughly 60% or so is either direct or indirect use of electricity. So this is a huge shift from what traditionally how electricity has been used. But the energy mix is really one that is still quite diverse into the future, where you have electricity, you have utilization of modern biomass. Every country in the region, in the world, has an agricultural community, agroeconomy, and it makes sense to utilize bioenergy resources sustainably where you can. It's a topic that needs to be part of the solution, so we try to make that point. And there's still a role for certain types of fossil fuels, predominantly oil and natural gas, so it's greatly diminished. Next slide, please. So I alluded to the fact that we were talking about the growth in electricity. In percentage terms, it increases to above 50%, but in absolute terms, we see a tripling of generation and roughly similar in terms of capacity expansion. And what we see is an energy system that obviously shifts towards renewables. This is not this won't just be driven by policy. This is actually starting to be driven in some countries actually for years in the past by the economics of the technology now. It's just in most cases, new solar and wind is cheaper than any existing fossil or nuclear energy source. And the challenge has moved from the affordability to the integration and flexibility that's needed in the system. Because as you see in the rightmost bars here for 1.5C, shares of renewables over 90%, and the variable component consisting of mainly solar and wind, approaching 2/3 in generation and over 3/4 in capacity. So it's a very different energy system, power system, with a lot of flexibility, and I'll mention that in a later slide. Next slide, please. Just if we look at mitigation options by sector, you could say broadly speaking, in transport and buildings, it's mostly an efficiency followed by electrification. Specifically, buildings is essentially electrification, though, with some clean cooking. But the transport sector is largely efficiency and electricity, with the exception of mainly two modes, shipping and aviation. There's an important role for biofuels in the case of aviation. And then there's we envision a pretty important role for hydrogen and derivatives, specifically ammonia, and trying to decarbonize shipping, or methanol, which can be used in existing ships. So that's the technologies. But where the most challenging area exists is, and also the largest emitter outside the power sector, is the industry sector. And we've looked at all types of industry, and there's a lot of literature and analysis on our website, and we do this in countries as well. We're trying to help outline and result in sort of a discussion around the types of technologies that can decarbonize cement, iron and steel, aluminum production, chemicals and petrochemicals, paper. So so forth. And you can see there the types of solutions are quite diverse. And here is really where we see the only role for CCS and its related carbon dioxide removal technologies. Because frankly, in the time frame we have with the existing stock and what's planned, it's very difficult to envision without those technologies getting to net zero in the industry sector, specifically in heavy industry. That's really where the challenge is. Next slide, please. We'd like to talk about investment. We were pleased to hear that the number floating around COP was 130 trillion, because we've been saying 130 trillion for 2 years. But what is needed is a lot of money, but it's not a lot if you look at it in cumulative terms over 30 years. So we anyway will invest under a reference case or planned energy scenario around $100 trillion. But a lot of that in a more normal instance would be invested into fossil fuel and supply infrastructure, with obviously a growing share of investment in renewables efficiency and related infrastructure. What we need to do is scale up, because of course the nature of the types of investments that are needed in a 1.5C world is different. Some of them do have higher upfront costs, and you need a significantly higher investment in enabling infrastructure and learning. For that, there's an incremental investment need of around a little over $30 trillion. But of course, put over 30 years, that's $1 trillion a year, which is just about 1% of GDP. So for an additional 1% of annual GDP, we can enable 1.5 degrees. What I didn't present here is we have cost analysis and economic analysis, socioeconomic, macroeconomic analysis that says this is actually, despite this increased investment, which isn't the same as cost, but it's an increased investment, the system cost for energy is more or less equal, and the benefits that result from reduced externalities, from health externalities and climate avoidance, damages from climate that's avoided, is 5 to 8 times higher than any additional costs, and there's positive macroeconomic and job benefits. So it's almost a no-brainer to do this. When countries have economic problems, they look to revitalize their economies with investments in infrastructure. This is the same thing. You do this, you have positive economic growth, and you happen to have a clean energy system on the side. You develop new industries. This should be a no-brainer, and I think this is the result of what we're seeing in climate. Thank you. That's next slide. Yeah. Just to wrap it up, the solutions I mentioned. I think there's two main. This needs to be the decade of action, and the two prevailing topics will be the flexibility side for the power sector. You're going to see massive growth in renewable power generation across all markets because it's economical. And so then the role of storage, the technologies, grids, system operation. It's not just about technology, it's about system operation and market design and business models. And of course, there's a lot. This is not a new topic. Countries like Germany have dealt with this. Countries outside of Europe have dealt with this. California's led the way. So there's a lot of existing knowledge, and it would be a pity not to learn from what others have done. And I think it's important that institutions such as IRENA, SCAP, the institution, and university research institutions really make an effort to help disseminate that knowledge and information. And that's what we're trying to do. So next slide, and I think that's all. If you'd like to get in touch, there's my email. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Nicholas. I think we had 3 extremely interesting presentations from different angles. Of course, we will continue with a brief discussion. Let me start with one point, one question to you, Nicholas. Those points that Frank made, particularly the point whether we have enough critical raw materials for this enormous process of enhancing solar and wind energy, and whether this doesn't create new dependencies which might contradict the wish for decentralization and more energy security. You haven't commented on this in your presentation, but is that because you don't see this as a problem, or because you don't want to have some water in the wine?
Oh, this is definitely excuse me, a topic that we are looking into. actually have I believe, a paper, some analysis that goes into this, and it is a topic. So I don't want to make any concrete statements. Obviously, there's been concerns around cobalt. There's the electric vehicle aspects. There are rare earths and raw materials. And this is an area where I know others are working in, and we do have analysis, but it's extremely hard when you start to look at supply decades into the future to make, I think, assessments as to if that can create dependencies and trade. I mean, we thought there was an issue with silicon supply 15 years ago for, guess what, the market responded, and now that's not a problem. And there is a lot of alternatives. This is emerging technologies. Batteries don't have to use lithium. You do not necessarily need cobalt. You can look at alternative materials. So while I'm not saying it's not an issue, I think that this is something to be mindful of, but it won't necessarily derail the transition. For me, a bigger issue is one is the ambition that is needed, the scale. It's really incredible. So just the hydrogen numbers that we present is 650 megatons of hydrogen production. That's 5 or 6 times what's produced today. But of course, that's all from natural gas, essentially some coal. That implies 6,000 gigawatts of electrolyzers. There's like tens of megawatts that exist today. So we're talking about a deployment level of electrolyzers that really is like a war mobilization effort just to get 10% of energy supplied from hydrogen. And so that to me is a huge challenge. A huge challenge is a more complex challenge is infrastructure. Countries are still building fossil fuel infrastructure. If they build natural gas supply infrastructure, which countries in Asia are doing, that is going to be used for decades. So the critical materials aspect I fully understand, and I think that needs to be understood. And it does have implications in the future, but what we're seeing right now is a continuation of investment in infrastructure that will lock in energy decisions for decades that need to be utilized. And also, I think a sort of an optimism in the part of the perspective from hydrogen that maybe misses the level and scope. And if you can't meet hydrogen demand with electrolyzers, then it will be met through the Haber-Bosch process for natural gas production. And almost none of that will be sequestered. So you'll still have emissions, and the CO2 balance will be barely better than an oil-based solution. It'll be better than coal, but barely better than oil solution. So then you just shifted the energy carrier into something else under the pretense that it will be CO2 into the future when it's not today. So this is where I see in the next 5 years or so, really a very strong, robust discussion around how we can stop fossil fuel infrastructure so as not to endanger supply. Of course, I mean, there is an argument to say we just stop oil exploration, we could have $200 a barrel oil soon enough if they can't meet supply, and it continues. But I'm concerned more about investment decisions that are being made today into fossil fuel supply, and over optimism towards the hydrogen is the key solution.
Well, let me continue with one more perhaps provocative question in your eyes concerning the latter point that you made. We have this enormous raise of electricity need, of power need. And what you're saying is we all want to do this. Basically, everything should go in the direction of doing this by renewable energies. I would say we will hardly be able to meet that. And it's a big illusion. These enormous numbers, and if you then want to create also the hydrogen market only by electrolyzers coming and renewable energy, it might be a little bit too optimistic. And well, why do you exclude from the beginning the possibility of taking natural gas and, for instance, biomethane pyrolysis, or with steam reformation, including CCS and CCU, which in general we think is important when it comes to the industry? Why do you exclude this for the energy production side? So if the production of hydrogen is CO2 neutral, even if it doesn't come from electrolysis. Why are you against that? Well, are you, and I ask that perhaps a bit provocative, is IRENA a lobbying institution for renewables, which of course is very legitimate, or is the main aim to do everything possible to fight climate change, even if it has, for instance, a part with gas or a part with nuclear? Any position on that's my second question. Any position concerning nuclear and the position of many countries also in Glasgow who say, well, it should be a coalition between nuclear and renewables that paves the way in a carbon-free world?
Thanks for blocking the question.
And then we come to Frank.
Yeah, so we don't just focus on renewables. The specific comment to nuclear, it's if your aim is CO2 reductions, we acknowledge the importance of that. If it exists in government plans, we have it. In fact, nuclear doesn't decline, but doesn't increase in our most ambitious scenario in our 1.5C. And that's despite the fact that a lot of existing old plants will be retired and they will be replaced based on countries' industrial preference to build nuclear. It's not a cost-effective power generation source, but if a country wants to build it, we don't object to it. We have 5,000 gigawatts of natural gas-based generation still in the system. It's more of a capacity than it is a generation source to provide backup. So we have considered in the power system gas flexibility measures, as is nuclear. So that makes up the roughly 10% of remaining generation, and that 25% or so, sorry, a lower share of capacity, of course, because it's a higher capacity factor, load hours technology, if need be. And then on the CCS, on the hydrogen side, 2/3 of our hydrogen is blue hydrogen, which equates to over 200 megatons. That's double, more or less, what's produced today. So we heavily, in my opinion, have emphasized blue hydrogen. It just happens to be the rest of electrolysis. And depending on who you believe, like hydrogen from electrolysis, green hydrogen from electrolysis, sometimes the next decade will become cheaper than blue hydrogen with CCS. Of course, we should have an honest discussion about CCS. It has never worked. It does not exist in any large scale except a few pilot projects, and they have capture rates below 70%. So you need to also have an honest discussion about the failure, the absolute and astonishing failure that has been CCS over the last decade, as was the hope for hydrogen 20 years ago until electric vehicles destroyed that, about the fallacy that's existed in the past about these technologies and whether or not that solution will be rectified in the future. Nuclear has never gotten cheaper. It's only gotten more expensive. So if countries want to build it, it's an industrial choice for their own interests, and we acknowledge that. CCS, we acknowledge it has a potential, but whether or not it's a least cost option, whether or not it's technologically feasible hasn't been proven into the past, whereas we've seen with battery electric vehicles and with renewable power technologies, significant decreases that have accelerated and been above anything that anybody projected. Same thing will happen with batteries and other technologies, and probably green hydrogen production. So this is why we're more bullish on those technologies, but not solely relying on those. And we just emphasize they're the bulk of the solution, but not entirely. And we do have a lot of CCS in our scenarios, to really acknowledging the infrastructure thing. If it exists, it's going to be utilized, so you might as well explore the CCS option. But I just wonder what it will be done at what cost, and if they'll have success in sequestering anything approaching 100% of the thing. In many cases, if you look at academic literature, why engage in CCS if you can just do carbon dioxide removal through afforestation and reforestation? That can be done for under $40 a ton if properly monitored. Why even bother with multi-$100 a ton solutions and CCS capture and removal? If you need to utilize it, we understand you need CCS as CO2 as a source to produce methanol. It has a role, but other than that, it seems to be this perpetual thing like fusion energy that we keep talking about for decades. Meanwhile, it also can be used as a as a justification for investment in fossil fuels, which is very dangerous if you care about 1.5C.
Okay. Thank you so much, Frank, please.
2 or 3 issues, also primarily to Nick. One of your slides was highlighting that the total final energy consumption by 2050 will be lower than in 2080. I'm a little bit skeptical. I see the huge potential for energy conservation and efficiency, no doubt about that. There's a basic, I think, agreement. But on the other hand, you have to balance that with the global population increase, with the rising living standards, and that the electricity demand has always, or the demand forecast has always been higher than the general energy demand growth. But to some extent, with the electrification, for example, we may even underestimate that growth. And I give you just one example. We talked, I think, with Michael also in my study about it. When you take the example of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, which had tremendously risen out of any forecast some years ago, meanwhile consuming the total energy consumption of Argentina, I think, and expected even to grow further. And it also highlights an experience we made in Germany. So Germany and Japan has always been the leaders, the global leaders of energy efficiency gains. And we had made these gains to a large extent, but at the same time, it had always been outbalanced by the electricity demand growth on our side at the same time. When you take computers, handies, whatever you have in our daily life today. And so at the end, when I'm looking to the older forecast, let's say 20 years ago with energy conservation and efficiency, yes, you have gains, but then you're looking to the electricity demand, etc., then these gains have been outbalanced by the growth. So in this respect, I'm probably a little bit more skeptical that the total final energy consumption as well as electricity consumption can be lower by 2050. Second point, back to the investments and to these 131 trillion US dollars, which are now being discussed at COP26. My understanding so far was always that's only realistically to mobilize with the global CO2 trade, which also depends on a certain kind of a global carbon price, which I don't see as realistic for the time being. And I'm looking to the carbon price in China, $5 to $7 US dollars, compared with 65 in Europe, as well as how many sectors are included, etc. There's such a huge divide that I can't see that kind of global carbon price, at least not over the next 10 years, really emerging. And that makes the climate club also very much discussed climate club so difficult. It also demands, and this would be a precondition, to have a kind of transparency, including about the supply chains we discussed in a different kind of context, which I don't see emerging either realistically. And we may even ask whether that kind of transparency over supply chains to calculate CO2 prices can be de-linked from transparency in other areas. And that's ultimately even linked to the political systems and economic competitive issues, etc. So I'm wondering why China should, for example, really agree to that, because it may lose its economic competitiveness, including to offer that kind of transparency. It would be needed for that. So these are maybe stop here. These two major questions.
Yeah, on the second question, I agree with you that the likelihood of a global carbon price is far off, and I don't know the best solution on a global level. You know, the border adjustment mechanism that EU is considering, you'd think could be an incentive for some countries to consider lowering their carbon intensity of their energy system. but that's a very hard thing to calculate and implement. But some solutions are needed. I think the financing, the Green Climate Fund, the 100 billion that now is supposed to be $1 trillion or whatever it was discussed, is maybe a step to essentially use a carrot to provoke change in many countries. Maybe that it may not be the most effective means of promoting a market, because you think like something like a carbon price or trading scheme would be the most economically competitive and efficient manner for enabling that, as opposed to direct investment or government grants or whatever the case may be, which aren't always the best way to spend money. But I don't know the solution to that, and that's I think probably the key topic to be had in international fora going forward. What the best solution would be. In terms of your other question, the 1.5 degree limit, which by the way, most scenarios don't meet 1.5 degrees. They overshoot 1.5 degrees and they come back down later, which avoids basically the whole purpose of 1.5. You still have all the climate effects. You just, but it's extremely challenging. So we're not saying that this is like, oh, okay, we'll do this. For instance, you mentioned Germany and Japan. Yes, Germany and Japan do a great job in efficiency, but they do 1% building renovation a year, 1% of the existing stock renovated a year. We say you need 3% globally. Every single building that exists today, almost every single building that exists today, will need to be renovated in an energy efficiency, maybe not zero energy, but in an energy efficiency manner in 30 years. You have the entire stock. Every new building built in 2025 needs to be low energy, and every new building built in 2030 needs to be zero energy. That's the pace that you need in the building sector. That has never been achieved anywhere, not in the most rich, wealthy European country or anywhere else. That's just the building sector. As I mentioned earlier, you need 6,000 gigawatts of hydrogen electrolyzers, plus you need double the current production of fossil fuel-based CO2 with blue CCS. Where that's going to be sequestered, I have no idea, and at what cost. And then you need probably, incidentally, the two things that are most likely going to be the easiest, though still challenging, is the electric vehicle, road electric vehicles. I mean, it's incredible the progress that's been made. We've been saying for years that you need 1 billion on the road by the end of the decade, and 150 million. 1 billion by 2050 and 150 million by the end of this decade. It looks like that will be met. And that's consistent with the trajectory in the road segment, the road mode of transport towards 1.5C. And incidentally, in the power sector, minus the increased demand that will come from hydrogen, I think we are on a trajectory, maybe not to 1.5C in the power sector, but it's approaching there, purely because the economics of renewable power generation is so good that a lot of countries are shifting. And when you combine that with fuel switch to natural gas, you can see emission reduction. I don't think we're quite there yet. Obviously, we're 30 years away from where we need to be, but we're doing that. And your last point related to why energy reduces, well, that's because the efficiency assumptions have to be so high. So the annual rate of efficiency improvement, though it is consistent with what the UN SDGs want in terms of doubling the rate of energy intensity improvement. But one of the big drivers is the electrification of end uses that results in significant improvement in final energy consumption. That's why it declines. On primary energy level, primary energy, it actually still grows, because you have, the convention for calculating primary energy differs, and how you calculate primary energy equivalence, you can come up with different numbers. But in general, the energy supply does grow, but a lot less than the 1.5C. But we're on final energy terms declines, mainly due to these efficiency measures that I mentioned and the electrification. But I also scare your skepticisms. We're nowhere near achieving any of this.
Please.
Yeah. Thank you.
Let me just unmute myself, sorry. So you would like me to come in on the questions that Nicholas was answering? Because I was listening to his response and also kind of thinking about our own Asia Pacific perspective. If that's okay, maybe I'll wind back to the first question, which was about critical raw materials and the likelihood of there being sufficient stock, or the likelihood of of any kind of absence of risk with having that massive expansion of energy efficiency and renewables by 2050 that was shown in Nicholas's slide. I think I'm encouraged by the fact that, you know, there is a lot of innovation, and I think where there's financial incentives and price signals, there will be innovation. And, you know, energy is one of the biggest global industries. There's a lot of revenue to be made. So where there are opportunities for innovators to create value, either through new devices that use different types of critical raw materials or innovative ways of accessing them, this is going to happen. I think what we can expect between now and 2050 is sort of incremental series of innovations, which will be a bit hard to predict. And, you know, if we look to what's happening in the energy system, it's change on the demand side and change on the supply side. And often we tend to really think about the supply side of things and less about the demand side. Just a couple of, you know, food for thought. We've talked about the growth of electricity. Electricity will become a very significant carrier, but we have opportunities for converting electricity to different kinds of products. So we have electricity can be used to create different kinds of gases, different materials. But also we have a lot of industries which currently run in kind of a continuous mode, but could be transferred to a batch mode. So in other words, in the middle of the night, when there happens to be a lot of wind power on a given electricity system, the marginal cost of electricity is very low. It might make sense to create whatever that product is in a batch mode. And I think the job is not for governments to sit there and try and create a blueprint for it all, rather to create the environment with the right price signals so that industry and the innovators can go and use this energy in a creative way and to use the most sustainable energy. And one big opportunity that I think is often missed is that if we look at the electricity system that has been built up in countries over the last 100 years, we actually have quite an inefficient system. You know, at the start of this system, we burn coal, we send 2/3 of that energy up to the atmosphere as waste heat, and the rest of it goes as electricity. But if we just look at the electricity grid, if you think of the sunk cost in all of those transmission towers, all of the transformers, all of the substations and distribution wires, it's billions and billions of dollars in any given country. And we use that infrastructure, we use actually about 1/3 of it. If you look at the capacity factor, we build it to meet the peak loads, whereas the average loads are much less. So if we're to fill in the missing part, we basically have the free use of a network. We can move energy around a country at very low marginal cost by making better use of kind of smoothing out the demand side. So this will be one big economic opportunity, which is synergistic with the use of more renewable energy. In terms of CRMs, I think one important distinction is when we're looking at CRMs and these other issues, we're not looking at them in isolation. We're looking at them relative to the existing practice or the status quo. So in energy, it's important not to look at things in isolation, but rather by comparing them to what we have already. So when we use CRMs, they are not destroyed. They're intrinsically there for another use, another life cycle. Whereas at the moment, our material use is coal, oil, and gas. And when we use those things right now, we really are destroying them. We're converting the molecules into smaller molecules and sending them into the atmosphere. So there's an opportunity cost argument there. As we move into the future, the next 3-4 generations might have better uses for those things. We can use coal to make carbon fiber. We can make oil to use different types of plastics. So in 200 years' time, people might say, wow, this generation, they burnt all this really important material in the Earth's crust, which we could have used in different ways. So I think that's an important distinction to make. Very quickly on nuclear, I think this is a tricky one because again, we shouldn't look at technologies in isolation, but their effect relative to the standalone, to the previous practice. So if we didn't have such a big nuclear fleet globally, we would have used coal to generate that electricity, and we would be closer to dangerous climate change. So what we do going forward, I think countries make their own individual choices, but over the last 20 years, we've seen the cost of new nuclear go up, not because the technology is getting worse, but because in fact, society's demand for safety is increasing. So the need to retrofit existing designs with more safe designs pushes up the cost. This is a big challenge for nuclear. We haven't seen these modular, small nuclear reactors come through to the market. All we've seen is large nuclear plants at increasingly higher cost. And I think governments will have less appetite for these if that trend continues. On CCS, just briefly, because I know Nicholas mentioned this and it's in his forecast. I think, by the way, this modeling is really important, not to set this artificial target of 100% renewable energy. Rather, how do you decarbonize as quickly as possible? Because if you go for this artificial target of 100% renewable energy without that little bit of balancing gas, you end up with a lot of overbuild of wind and solar. If you look at studies that have been done, like Stanford University did a big study of the United States, there are others, there's one in Australia too. If you're trying to get to 100% renewables, it's quite artificial because you need a lot more wind and solar, and you have a huge amount of curtailment, which doesn't make sense from a point of view of economics or the embedded carbon in all of those systems. But in CCS, there's a very important distinction to be made. Are we talking about carbon capture and storage in power stations, or are we talking about it in the industry, such as enhanced gas recovery or in the cement industry? Because these are two very different things, and I find them continually conflated. So I really think it's important to separate these things and analyze them in separation. On the industry side, when we're talking about enhanced gas recovery and other applications where there are large point sources of CO2, this seems to be progressing rather well. If we talk about the coal power generation side, I tend to agree with Nicholas. 20 years ago, people were talking about this, that it will be here in 10 years' time. It seems to get further away each decade. And at the same time, the renewables have really shot ahead in terms of cost. So if CCS is to catch up on a level playing field in terms of cost, renewables are too far ahead. You simply won't get, when you either retrofit or design new plants with carbon capture and storage, you have greater parasitic losses, higher costs all around. So I don't see how this is going to be cost competitive. And like Nicholas said, it's a slippery slope, because if you say it's okay to invest in new coal-fired power because CCS as a technology is just around the corner, well, it's been just around the corner for a long time now. So I think we're right to be a bit cynical about that. So maybe I'll stop there in terms of time as we're running out and pass back to you.
Frank, bitte. Ich würde sagen, das ist, Frank, dann aber auch schon dein final word. If Nicholas and Michael agree, I would say Frank gets for a final time the floor. Please. And well,
yeah,
go ahead.
Short comment or a short question to Michael. When we discussed critical raw materials, we basically agreed there are solutions, at least in the mid and long term, to use reuse, substitution, etc. But we also need to be realized, I think, also the constraints which are still there. All these solutions, so-called solutions or substitute reuse, have also its own constraints. But I also remember after the Chinese-Japanese rare earth conflict and the exploding prices, actually after 2011, we had, for example, 400 startups for the diversification of rare earths. And in 2015-16, hardly anyone has survived. And the reason for that is, even in Germany, by the way, we have rare earths. We could produce it theoretically. But it's environmentally so polluting that it's not realistic for the time. And even also in other European countries, it's extremely difficult, despite efforts by the European Commission to promote and finance those projects. So in reality, at the very end, you have solutions on the paper, but politically speaking, as you need public acceptance, particularly in democracies in all these kind of respects, then it turns out that's not being able to implement it. So a circular economy will play definitely a great role, as we discussed it in the paper, not just in Europe, I think in Asia too. But we should also not be too over-optimistic. What you have on paper can actually always be implemented, operationalized in reality. So here again, we need to be probably a little bit more cautious And we should also not overall underestimate the security risk, at least not for the time being, for the next 10, 15 years, as the oversupplies, the monopoly China has in this respect won't go away. China also see it, politically speaking or geopolitically speaking, in preserving it. And it has done it in the past, also by subsidizing its own industry to an extent which destroyed the Western critical raw materials industry in the US and elsewhere. So here again, we have sometimes technological, technocratic solutions, but that depends also on the wider geopolitical conditions, global cooperation, global governance, political global governance issues. And unfortunately, that is not the most attractive political environment. Despite new cooperation between China and the US, we have, as it has been announced yesterday at the climate front, I don't think that a lot of these geopolitical fronts, the issues will go away, and they will have an impact on all these climate change technology cooperation, collaboration, which you need internationally, as well as a strengthened multilateral system. And unfortunately, we don't go, or the road is not going in the right way.
Yeah, when you put it that way, it looks very messy. Frank, is a bit of a depressing picture. But
yeah,
you're right. I think we've got some significant challenges ahead of us.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I think this was an extremely interesting discussion, and we will make a lot of use of your comments in our seminars. I'm teaching right now a course on climate diplomacy. And I will definitely bring you in with some of what you've said. Let me just sum up, especially given Michael's last comment towards Frank. I think we all share the view that we have to do everything to fight climate change. And we all agree on the ambitious goals of the EU Commission, for instance, and of the Paris Agreement. But sometimes I think it is very important that we broaden our view and not only focus on ambitious goals, idealistic moves, but highlight the problems and challenges. Otherwise, this happens what the Green Party sees today in Germany. Big ambitious goals, and now they have to govern. And one of the first things that the new government said was, we need 10 to 15 new gas power plants because the sun is not shining all the time and the wind is not blowing all the time. And we want to get rid of coal and nuclear at this, well, practically the same time and faster. We want to get rid of coal than anticipated, which is a good aim, of course. But that is very difficult for the green base, for the activists with Friday for Future, because there the expectations are very high. And it is now the task of the Green Party to bring their ambitious aims, the clear motivation, and ground it so that it becomes realistic. And that might cause a lot of frustration with these activist movements and their idealism. So I think it is very important that, for instance, you with Irina, start not only to propagate your aims and what you want to do, but also say, well, but there are very difficult challenges. For instance, if someone like Irina would come and say, well, we definitely need CCS and CCU for the industry if we want to get carbon free. I think those points are sometimes not highlighted enough. And if that would come from your side, it would make the overall plea much more credible. But having said so, I think it's great that we have IRENA. It's great that we have ASCAP. And it's also great that we have EUCERS and Frank Umbach. So thank you very much for this insight. And well, it was hopefully not the last time that we discussed points in a seminar of EUCERS. Goodbye.
Yeah, many thanks to Nicholas and Michael.
Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure to join you.
Yeah. No, thanks for having time, particularly also to Nicholas being, I think, involved in another conference. Again, we would be happy for any talks also on future collaboration. Let me just know it. I'm living in the vicinity of Bonn, so it's not a problem to arrange things. And I hopefully see Michael back in Asia, be in Singapore or somewhere else.
Yeah,
or be it digitally.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Bye-bye. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.